If you're enjoying this story from the Old West, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of courage, redemption, and the untamed frontier. Your support helps us bring these forgotten stories to life. The autumn wind of 1873 carried the scent of dying leaves and wood smoke across the rolling hills of Kansas Territory. Captain Marcus Sullivan limped through the dusty streets of Cedar Ridge, his left leg bearing the permanent reminder of Confederate grapeshot that had torn through his thigh at Gettysburg. The war had ended 8 years ago, but its echoes still haunted the weathered faces of men who had seen too much death. The morning sun cast long shadows between the wooden buildings as Marcus made his way to the general store, his walking stick tapping a steady rhythm against the hard-packed earth. The town was awakening slowly, shopkeepers sweeping their storefronts while the blacksmith's hammer rang out from his forge. Cedar Ridge was a place where people minded their own business, where questions weren't asked about a man's past as long as he paid his debts. Inside Morrison's general store, the familiar smell of coffee beans and leather goods greeted Marcus as he pushed through the door. The bell above jangled softly, announcing his arrival to old Pete Morrison, who looked up from his ledger with tired eyes. But it wasn't Pete who caught Marcus's attention that morning. It was the girl sitting motionless on a wooden crate near the back of the store, her small frame hunched as if trying to disappear entirely. She couldn't have been more than 15, with tangled brown hair that fell like a curtain across her face. Her dress was little more than rags, patched and repatched with different colored fabric, but it was her eyes that struck Marcus most deeply when she briefly looked up at him. They held a depth of pain that no child should ever know, a silence that seemed to stretch far beyond the normal bounds of shyness. Those eyes spoke of horrors witnessed and trust broken. Standing beside her was a man Marcus had never seen before, tall and gaunt, with the hollow look of someone who had lost everything to drink and desperation. His clothes were travel-stained, his boots worn thin at the heels. When he spoke to Pete Morrison, his voice carried the rough edge of a man who had given up on dignity long ago. The conversation was conducted in hushed tones, but Marcus caught enough words to understand what was happening. The man was selling the girl, his own daughter, from what Marcus could piece together from the fragments of conversation. The price being discussed was pathetically small, barely enough to keep a man in whiskey for a week. Pete Morrison looked uncomfortable with the transaction, his weathered hands fidgeting with his apron as he counted out the coins. The whole scene made Marcus's stomach turn with a mixture of disgust and profound sadness. The girl never spoke throughout the entire exchange. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, as if she had learned that any movement might bring unwanted attention. When her father finally pocketed the money and turned to leave, he didn't even look back at her. The door slammed behind him with a finality that seemed to echo through the store like a gunshot, leaving behind only the smell of desperation and broken dreams. Pete Morrison stood behind his counter, clearly at a loss for what to do with his new acquisition. He kept glancing at the girl, then at Marcus, as if hoping someone else would solve this uncomfortable problem for him. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall and the distant sound of horses moving through the street outside. Marcus found himself studying the girl more closely. Despite her obvious malnutrition and the haunted look in her eyes, there was something about her that reminded him of his younger sister Sarah, who had died of fever when she was just 12. Maybe it was the way she held herself, with a dignity that poverty and abuse couldn't quite destroy. Or perhaps it was the intelligence he glimpsed in her dark eyes when she thought no one was watching. Setting down his walking stick, Marcus approached the counter where Pete Morrison was still counting and recounting the money the girl's father had left behind. The storekeeper looked up with relief when Marcus cleared his throat, as if grateful for any distraction from the awkward situation that had been thrust upon him. The morning light streaming through the store's windows cast everything in a golden glow that seemed at odds with the darkness of what had just transpired. "Pete," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the authority that 8 years of civilian life hadn't quite erased. "I'll take the girl off your hands." He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch, the coins inside jingling softly as he set it on the counter. "This should cover whatever you paid for her, plus a bit extra for your trouble." Udu, the storekeeper's eyes widened with obvious relief as he quickly pocketed the money. The girl looked up at Marcus with a mixture of fear and resignation, as if she had learned to expect nothing good from the adults in her life. Her silence was complete, not just the absence of words, but the absence of any sound at all. Marcus wondered if she was truly mute, or if trauma had simply stolen her voice, along with everything else. He had seen soldiers return from battle with similar wounds, invisible scars that ran deeper than any physical injury. "Come on, then," Marcus said gently, extending his hand toward her. "Let's get you something to eat." The girl hesitated for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if trying to determine whether this was another trap or perhaps impossibly a kindness. Finally, she stood on unsteady legs and followed him toward the door, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. As they stepped out into the morning sunlight, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a familiar coat. He had no idea what he was going to do with a traumatized, mute girl, but he knew he couldn't leave her to whatever fate Pete Morrison might have arranged. The streets of Cedar Ridge seemed different now, as if the simple act of taking responsibility for another human being had changed his perspective on everything around him. His small house on the outskirts of town had been his refuge for the past 5 years, a place where he could tend his garden and read his books without being reminded of the war that had taken so much from him. The house was modest but clean, with a stone fireplace that he had built himself and windows that looked out over the rolling prairie. It was a peaceful place, or had been until now. The girl followed him silently up the path to his front door, her eyes taking in every detail of her new surroundings with the wariness of someone who had learned that safety was always temporary. Marcus opened the door and gestured for her to enter first, noting how she hesitated at the threshold, as if crossing it might trigger some unseen trap. The interior of the house was simple but comfortable, with handmade furniture and books lining the walls. "Are you hungry?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer from the way her clothes hung loose on her thin frame. She nodded once, a quick economical movement that spoke of someone who had learned to communicate without words. He led her to the kitchen, where the morning light streamed through gingham curtains his late wife had made years ago. The memory of Sarah's hands sewing those curtains brought a brief pang of grief, but also a strange comfort. Marcus busied himself preparing a simple meal of eggs and bacon, the sizzling filling the quiet kitchen with homey sounds. The girl sat at his wooden table, her hands folded in her lap, watching his every movement with the intensity of someone who had learned that survival depended on reading the intentions of others. She was still as a statue, but Marcus could sense the coiled tension in her small body, ready to flee at the first sign of danger. When he set the plate before her, she looked up at him with something that might have been gratitude, though it was mixed with such wariness that it broke his heart. She ate slowly, methodically, as if she wasn't sure when her next meal might come. Marcus poured himself a cup of coffee and sat across from her, giving her space while making it clear that he wasn't going anywhere. The silence between them was companionable rather than awkward. After she had finished eating, Marcus showed her to the small room that had once been his study. It wasn't much, just a bed and a chest of drawers, but it was clean and private. The girl stood in the doorway, looking around the room, as if she couldn't quite believe it was meant for her. When Marcus set a clean nightgown on the bed, he saw her eyes widen with something that might have been wonder. "This is your room," he said simply. "No one will bother you here." She nodded once, that same economical movement, and for the first time since he had met her, Marcus saw something other than fear in her eyes. It was small, fragile as a bird's egg, but it was there. Hope, perhaps, or at least the possibility of hope. He left her alone to settle in, closing the door gently behind him. Over the following days, Marcus began to establish a routine that included his silent houseguest. He would wake before dawn to tend to his horses and the small vegetable garden behind the house, while she would emerge from her room like a ghost, moving silently through the house as if afraid to disturb the dust motes dancing in the morning light. She never spoke, never made any sound at all, but she began to help with small tasks around the house. Marcus noticed that she had a particular affinity for the horses. When he worked in the stable, she would appear at his side, her small hands surprisingly gentle and skilled as she helped brush down the animals. The horses seemed to sense her quiet nature and responded to her with a calmness that impressed Marcus. It was as if she spoke a language that required no words, communicating through touch and patience. The people of Cedar Ridge, with their frontier pragmatism, accepted the girl's presence without too many questions. They had all seen enough hardship to understand that sometimes a person needed to be given a chance to heal. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the boarding house, brought over some of her late daughter's clothes that she thought might fit. Dr. Hayes, the town's physician, made a quiet house call and pronounced the girl undernourished but healthy. As the weeks passed, Marcus began to see subtle changes in his young ward. The constant tension in her shoulders began to ease, and she no longer jumped at every unexpected sound. She still didn't speak, but she would sometimes catch his eye and offer a small nod of acknowledgement or gratitude. It was progress, slow as the changing of seasons, but progress nonetheless. The house, which had been his solitary retreat, began to feel like something approaching a home. One evening, as the first snows of winter began to dust the prairie, Marcus sat by the fireplace reading when he became aware that the girl was standing in the doorway, watching him. She had been living in his house for nearly 2 months now, and this was the first time she had approached him of her own accord. She held something in her hands, a piece of paper that she had carefully folded and unfolded many times. When she finally approached and handed him the paper, Marcus saw that it was covered with pencil drawings. They were crude but expressive, showing scenes from their daily life together. There was a drawing of him feeding the horses, another of her helping in the garden, and one that showed the two of them sitting at the kitchen table. At the bottom of the page, written in careful letters, was a single word: "Thank you." The emotion that washed over Marcus was unexpected in its intensity. He had been a soldier, had commanded men in battle, had seen death and destruction that would haunt him for the rest of his days. But this simple drawing, this small gesture of gratitude from a broken girl, moved him more than any medal or commendation ever had. He looked up at her and saw that her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You're welcome," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You're welcome here for as long as you want to stay." She nodded once, then surprised him by moving closer to the fireplace, settling herself on the small stool beside his chair. They sat together in companionable silence, watching the flames dance and listening to the wind whistle around the eaves of the house. Winter settled over Cedar Ridge like a blanket, bringing with it the kind of cold that seemed to seep into a person's bones and stay there. Marcus and the girl developed a routine that revolved around the simple tasks of survival. They would rise before dawn to tend to the animals, then spend the day working on small projects around the house. She had proven to be remarkably skilled with a needle, mending clothes and household items with a precision that spoke of long practice. Marcus began to teach her to read, using the Bible and some of his other books. She was a quick learner, absorbing information with the hunger of someone who had been denied education for too long. She would sit by the fireplace in the evenings, her finger tracing the words on the page while Marcus read aloud. Sometimes he would catch her lips moving silently, forming the words she was learning, though she never made a sound. The isolation of winter brought them closer together, two damaged souls finding comfort in each other's company. Marcus told her stories of his life before the war, of his wife Sarah, and the dreams they had shared. He spoke of his service in the Union Army, of the battles he had fought and the friends he had lost. She listened with the intensity of someone who understood that these stories were precious gifts, pieces of a life freely shared. In return, though she never spoke, she began to share her own stories through her drawings. She would show him pictures of a farm, of a woman who Marcus assumed was her mother, of happier times before whatever tragedy had brought her to that general store. The drawings were windows into a world that had been lost, but they also showed Marcus that despite everything she had endured, something essential in her remained unbroken. As spring approached, Marcus noticed that the girl had begun to make small sounds. Not words exactly, but little humming noises when she worked in the garden, or soft breathing sounds when she was concentrating on her reading. It was as if her voice was slowly returning, like a bird learning to sing again after a long winter. Marcus never pushed her to speak, understanding instinctively that her silence was both a protection and a wound that would heal in its own time. The first real breakthrough came on a warm April morning when Marcus was working in the stable and heard a commotion from the chicken coop. He rushed outside to find a fox attacking the hens, and without thinking, he grabbed his rifle and fired. The shot was true, and the fox dropped immediately. As Marcus stood there, breathing heavily from the sudden excitement, he heard a sound that made his heart stop. "Thank you." The words were barely above a whisper, rusty from disuse, but they were clear and unmistakable. The girl was standing in the doorway of the coop, a rescued hen cradled in her arms, and she was speaking for the first time since he had known her. Her voice was soft and slightly hoarse, but it was the most beautiful sound Marcus had ever heard. From that day forward, her voice returned gradually, like a stream slowly filling with snowmelt. She would speak a few words here and there, usually in response to something Marcus had said or done. Her name, she told him, was Emma. She was 16 years old, and she had been silent for over a year, ever since the night her mother had died and her father had begun drinking himself into the kind of despair that made selling his own daughter seem like a reasonable solution to his problems. Emma's stories, told in fragments over the course of many evenings, painted a picture of a childhood that had been happy until tragedy struck. Her mother had been a teacher, and Emma had inherited her love of learning and her gentle nature. When pneumonia took her mother during a particularly harsh winter, Emma's father had been unable to cope with his grief and had turned to the bottle for comfort. The farm had failed, debts had mounted, and eventually the unthinkable had become inevitable. As Emma's voice grew stronger, so did the bond between them. Marcus realized that what had begun as a simple act of charity had become something much more profound. This girl, who had been broken by the cruelty of the world, had somehow managed to heal something in him that he hadn't even realized was wounded. The house that had been his refuge became a home, filled with the sound of her voice and the warmth of her presence. Summer brought new challenges and new opportunities. Emma had grown stronger and more confident, her voice now a regular part of their daily conversations. She had proven to be remarkably intelligent, quick to learn not just reading and writing, but also the practical skills of frontier life. Marcus began to think about her future, about what would happen when she was old enough to make her own way in the world. But Emma, it seemed, had her own ideas about her future. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, she turned to him with a seriousness that reminded him of her mother, whose ghost he sometimes glimpsed in Emma's expressions and gestures. "I want to be a teacher," she said quietly. like my mother was. I want to help other children learn to read and write." Marcus felt a surge of pride at her words, recognizing the strength it took for someone who had been through what she had endured to want to dedicate her life to helping others. He promised her that he would do everything in his power to make her dream possible. The years that followed were marked by steady progress and growing happiness. Emma threw herself into her studies with the determination of someone who understood the value of education. Marcus arranged for her to work with the town school teacher, Mrs. Henderson, who was impressed by Emma's intelligence and dedication. When Mrs. Henderson announced her intention to retire, it seemed natural that Emma would be her successor. Marcus officially adopted Emma when she turned 18, giving her his name and his protection under the law. The ceremony was simple, conducted by Judge Mitchell in the courthouse, but it was one of the most meaningful moments of Marcus's life. As he signed the papers that made Emma his legal daughter, he reflected on the strange turns that life could take, how an act of compassion could transform two lives so completely. Emma Sullivan, as she was now known, became Cedar Ridge's new schoolteacher at the age of 20. She brought to the role a unique understanding of children who had been damaged by life's cruelties, an ability to reach the unreachable and teach the unteachable. Her classroom became a sanctuary for children who, like her, had known hardship and loss. She never spoke of her own past to her students, but they sensed in her someone who understood their struggles. Marcus, now in his 50s, found a new purpose in supporting Emma's work. He helped her with supplies for the school, used his carpentry skills to build desks and shelves, and served as a quiet presence in the background of her life. The wound in his leg still bothered him on cold days, but his heart had healed in ways he had never expected. The house that had once been his solitary retreat was now filled with the sound of Emma's voice and the laughter of the children she sometimes brought home for dinner. The town of Cedar Ridge grew and prospered, and Emma's school became the heart of the community. Parents would travel from neighboring settlements to enroll their children in her care, drawn by her reputation for patience and excellence. She never married, claiming that her students were her children and that she had no need for any other family. Marcus understood her choice, recognizing in it the same dedication that had made her mother such a beloved teacher. As the years passed, Marcus began to slow down, the accumulated effects of his war wound and the passage of time taking their toll. Emma, now a mature woman in her 30s, took over more of the household duties while continuing her teaching. She cared for Marcus with the same gentle attention that he had once shown her, the roles of protector and protected shifting naturally as their relationship evolved. On quiet evenings, they would sit together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in familiar colors. Emma would tell him about her students, about the progress they were making, and the challenges they faced. Marcus would share memories of his younger days, stories that Emma had heard many times before, but never tired of hearing. These conversations, filled with the comfortable rhythms of a shared life, were precious to both of them. Marcus passed away peacefully in his sleep on a warm October morning, 15 years after he had first encountered Emma in Morrison's general store. Emma found him in his bed, his face peaceful and his hands folded on his chest, as if he had simply decided that his work on earth was complete. The funeral was well attended, with people coming from all over the territory to pay their respects to a man who had touched many lives through his simple act of kindness. Emma inherited the house and the small plot of land that Marcus had cultivated so carefully. She continued to teach, becoming a beloved figure in the community and a mentor to young teachers who came to learn from her methods. She never forgot the lesson that Marcus had taught her through his actions, that sometimes the most profound changes in the world come not from grand gestures, but from small acts of compassion. The story of Marcus Sullivan and Emma became a legend in Cedar Ridge, passed down through generations as an example of how two broken people could heal each other and create something beautiful from the ruins of their pain. Emma lived to be an old woman, dying peacefully in the same house where she had found sanctuary all those years ago. She was buried next to Marcus in the Cedar Ridge Cemetery, under a simple stone that read, Emma Sullivan, teacher and beloved daughter. What do you think about this story of redemption and healing? Have you ever witnessed or experienced how a single act of kindness can completely transform someone's life? Share your thoughts in the comments below about the power of compassion to heal even the deepest wounds.